Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to the DME for Peace community, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. These Thursday Talk webinars on DME for Peace are made possible with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York through the Peace Building Evaluation Consortium. Just in case you've forgotten, my name is Jack Farrell, and I'm the DME for Peace project manager at Search for Common Ground, based in an unseasonably snowy Washington, D.C. Today, I'm delighted to welcome our guest, Deborah Levine, who is going to lead a discussion on Unbiased Guide for Leaders, Unconscious Bias and Conscious Choice. Just a note, if you have a question during the webinar, you can write it in the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard throughout Deborah's presentation, and we will address it once we reach the question and answer section. I'm now going to hand over to our guest. Deborah, you're very welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Jack. I really appreciate the opportunity to share my work and hopefully to assist people in this very timely but difficult topic of unconscious or implicit bias. I'd like to share with you first how this work came to be, and I will look to my hometown at this time, Chattanooga, Tennessee, and how it became a global village about 20 years ago and needed to have a different mindset to be able to communicate globally and to be part of the global economy successfully. In responding to globalization, there needed to be a new way of thinking, and that is how I created the matrix model management system, having understood that being a global citizen is very different than being a citizen of a small southern city. I started something called the Women's Council on Diversity and used my background in cultural anthropology and urban planning to create this process. It refines the decision-making skills, it boosts emotional intelligence, and most importantly, it develops cross-cultural expertise. It gives your brain the infrastructure, if you will, to handle immense amounts of data and reorganize it in something that does not necessarily look like what you're familiar with. And that was key to be able to serve on international teams, interface with the new industries, whether it was Volkswagen or Wacker Chemical that were coming into the area, and of course all the different vendors from around the country who are not used to Southern culture, which is quite specific in the United States and one that goes many generations back. If we did not do this, we saw that there were costs. There was a problem with team collaboration and understanding and sharing of knowledge that was limited, and it interfered with marketing to diverse cultural groups. People didn't quite understand what was being said, and most importantly here, it decreased the community engagement and support. And we wanted to be able to greet our newcomers, and we really spent quite a bit of time in learning how to do that. It was not a natural thing. Many of the things that arose in the process would today be called unconscious bias, but back then it was simply a learning experience and trying to overcome stereotypes that we had embedded in our brains for so long in our personal and community history. As today, it really has a very similar effect, unconscious bias and the stereotypes that we ran into in looking at globalization. Internally, within the workplace, that unconscious bias divides. There are legal issues in terms of a hostile environment because people get angry easily these days, and unconscious bias can trigger those angry responses. In many ways, we've seen in the news that the situation can be a spoiler of reputations, and therefore companies have taken action to make sure that the unconscious biases do not uh, surface in ways that uh, mar the brand, as in Starbucks, for example. And again, it is a recruitment barrier. We tend to recruit those who look exactly like us, which only perpetuates our isolation. And so there is a general loss of trust involved when there is unconscious bias at work that does not help us, does not improve relations, and we're not fully aware of exactly what's happening. We just know we are suspicious. And if we go to the issue of trust, we recognize that it is the key, okay, to communication, as in this quote from Stephen Covey: trust is the glue of life. It's the most essential ingredient in effective communication. It's the foundational principle that holds all relationships. Trust, if you lose it, right, is very difficult to gain back. So you don't want to lose it, you want to grow it, and have some trust sort of in the bank for the times when maybe you do make mistakes and you need some forgiveness, and you have already had a relationship that is positive and will lead to that. So a lot of the work that I do with the Unbiased Toolkit, okay, is not necessarily aiming for 100%, okay, doing the right thing, thinking the right thing all the time. It is for building a process of awareness and sensitivity that leads to a competence in terms of conscious choices. And we have three basic categories in which we do this in the Unbiased Toolkit. The neurocommunication one it features storytelling as awareness building tool, and that comes from my very early work in cultural anthropology, where stories have incredible power to communicate large amounts of data in a very short, abbreviated versions, whether it's on Twitter or a memoir. You have basically a full range of the values and information packed into a small story that carries a great deal of weight. And that's why I emphasize the storytelling mode. For number two, the emotional intelligence category, I have built a system of emotional metrics because I believe that if people can measure their emotional situation, how they feel, that they have better control over it. And we will go into that. The third, the problem solving and planning, refers to wise decision making and the ability to unpack how you make a decision and how to answer a question with a relevant answer rather than the answer that seems that you would like to have promoted, but it doesn't necessarily apply in the situation you find yourself in. So when we start the unbiased process, I'll share with you that the book that I've written, right, is not necessarily really a textbook. It is a workbook. And I do that because when I deal with teams who want to look at the issue of unconscious bias, I like for them to be able to write down their comments, their thoughts, their suggestions, their ideas. Writing them down makes it come alive, makes it more of a real thing in your brain, and it also allows you to share with your team and get feedback, which is very helpful in building the awareness and sensitivity needed to unpack the unconscious bias. So if we go to neurocommunication, as I said, you're going to build the awareness, your self-awareness of your own thinking and your awareness of the thinking of others. And that is where you use the storytelling strategies to increase your cultural competence. Here is a matrix for the storytelling strategies. And it's very much like a story that a reporter would perhaps make: who, what, when, where, how, and why. And I have given them slightly different topics, titles, so that you can fill those in the team practice, and each one of them has this to fill out in their workbook. One thing that I would like to point out in this is the cultural expression. What this means is music, movies, TV, icons, symbols. These are shorthand for entire cultural value systems. They exist in almost every single culture, although they take a different form. And that form represents so much. It's an encapsulation of the values and the history, the demographics of that cultural group. It's why they are so powerful, but it's also why if you use them, they can possibly signal an unconscious bias all by themselves. So it's very important to be aware of the cultural expressions that you use. When we look at the culture map, the cultural competence, we look at the diversity that we'll be dealing with in multi-level. The geography and history, the demographics and diversity, the mindset and beliefs can all blend together so that what we call the intersectionality of diversity is always with us. We need to be aware that there is no one diversity category for any of us, and to look more closely at what people are representing and what they have to say. Is it the particular geography and particular diversity that leads to their mindset and beliefs? And every time you change a detail, you are going to change the whole gestalt, the whole picture of that person. And so there is an emphasis on looking at unconscious bias, on being aware that you need to be flexible in applying all of this because the variables are immense in number. When we look at the emotional intelligence aspect of this, right, we look at not only how we respond, but how we interpret other people's behavior. This is a very complex idea, and I really saw when I was doing teamwork all those years ago how difficult it was when there was a culture clash. And so we built the emotion metrics barometer with 4 different metrics that go from the ideal, most centered feelings to okay, tolerable, number 2, ramped up slightly to uncomfortable, and if that isn't resolved, then we go to nightmare and pain. It's painful. Frequently, when we reach that point of painful, our adrenaline kicks in and we have a knee-jerk reaction that is frequently not helpful. And then we have to build trust all over again. One of the things that I tell people is that it takes 3 weeks to build new habits. And so for those 3 weeks, every day at least once or twice a day, you need to be in a situation and apply one of these emotion metrics to it so that you get used to doing that and you have your own barometer. And when you have a team and you have everyone using these metrics, right, you are able to say, well, I'm at a 3 or I'm at a 2, and you don't have to give much explanation, which makes it more easily negotiable when there are problems. And when there are problems, what do? Right? We can simply just walk away from it. We can resolve it either by resolving the misunderstanding or agree to disagree. Perhaps we manage it, right? We can negotiate down to a number 2. We can control it through company policies. And that's a frequent way of dealing with it. If you have a company policy that works with you. An impasse, when it's a nightmare, and there is no position, it's a position from which there is no escape. What can you do? And this is where people frequently are fired or they resign. You can punt to number 1, avoid it and walk away from it and hope that it doesn't come up again. And give yourself some time, buy some time to resolve behind the scenes. So I look at the conflict levels in the emotion barometer as a way to deal with the emotions involved in unconscious biases that come to the surface. And you need those skills for sure. You need to be able to make wise decisions around unconscious bias. The way to do that is to look at what is decision making. How do we define it? Can we refine it? And we look at a 5-level decision making list. What do you know? What is the character, your dependability? What is your humanity? That means your ability to be empathetic. What is your vision? And what action are you taking? Are you doing this yourself? Are you delegating? And that comes last after you make sure that you are able to fill in each of the other categories. Trust is in character. And again, if you've lost the trust, you need to go back to all 5 categories and reboot. Now I look again, however, mostly at vision when planning. The planning comes from my work in urban planning, which requires this kind of spreadsheet from vision, which is maybe 5 to 10 years out, mission 3 to 5, goals 2 to 3, and objectives 1, and the benchmarks which show what you're going to achieve. By putting together a planning matrix like this, your decisions become easier because they fit into the planning that you have. If you have no plan, it's as if you have no policy. And it's a sort of free-for-all. And that's where you get into trouble with unconscious bias, because there are no policies and plans in place, okay, to fall back on should you reach the nightmare and impasse level of emotion and conflict. Putting that all together, it takes time, it takes a team, and it takes individual commitment. But by doing so, the awareness is heightened, the sensitivity is increased, and the competence in dealing with it all, right, is intensified. And that's what we are looking at, a process that can be applied across many industries, organizations, communities, cultures, to improve the interface of relationships. And I thank you very much for spending this time and allowing me to share the creation of the Unbiased Guide and how it will change our brains as well as our teams. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Deborah, for an amazingly sort of detailed presentation. For those of you who are new to the Thursday Talks, we're now going to open up to questions from the audience. A couple of notes about our format. You can ask your question in two ways. The first is through the question function on GoToWebinar, where you can type your question, and many of you have already done that today. The second is to click on the little hand icon, which will raise your hand and allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. And just note, these talks are recorded and posted on Dean for Peace's media gallery, so that the entire community can learn from this discussion, even though they weren't able to directly participate. I'm going to be quite selfish here, Deborah, and ask the first question. So one of the things I was curious about was your when you're talking about emotional metrics and the time it takes to develop habits. How did you find out, or how did you learn that habits take 3 weeks to be formed, to become naturalized?
Oh, I started to do research and scientific research on what it takes to form a new habit, and that's what came up. And then in putting it into practical use, I found that indeed, after about 3 weeks of everyday practice, people felt more comfortable. It became much more instinctual.
Great. So now we're going to jump into the audience questions, and the first one comes from Nathan Bala, who said, "Thank you for a great presentation." Nathan's put together quite a few questions, so I'm going to break it down into two sets. The first one is, what was the problem set, the background that led to the design of the model management system? What informed the design, as well as the peculiarity, the variables and assumptions, as well as the peculiarities of the environment? And was the model tested extensively?
Yes, the model had been started to be formulated in the Chicago area, where there was a street riot over religious symbols in the schools. And my role was to create a process to help resolve the antagonisms involved. As time went on, the process that I started there became much more formalized here in Chattanooga. And the reason for it was the globalization issue. The arrival of international industries in a small southern town created quite a bit of culture clash. In particular, the German culture, which is quite direct and low context, clashed with the Southern culture, which was indirect and high context. And there was a lot of confusion and misunderstandings. And I was actually found through my work online by a consulting agency in New York City, hired to train people coming into the South so that they could make the most of their time here. That culture clash otherwise would have cut into their efficiency. So that's how it came to be.
Great, thank you, Deborah. And Nathan's next question is, how adaptable is this model to very hostile environments with sensitivity to the diversity of culture, ethnicity, traditional systems, and religious affiliations?
Yes, thank you for that question. As I mentioned before, the origin of my work was in religious divisive groups in Chicago. Um, this started in 1990, quite some years ago, dealing with this situation. Fascinatingly, much of what we dealt with then has not changed. If anything, it's become more intense. And I have found that this process is for leaders. That's why it's for leadership. It may not apply to every individual involved in the divisive situation. But we need the leaders to be able to communicate well and deal with the unconscious bias amongst themselves if they're going to be effective in as it goes down vertically through groups and cultures. So that's why it does work, even in divisive situations like religious clashes.
So, Deborah, I guess my my next question, and this has been touched on by a couple of people in the audience, including Arielen Froelich, and apologies for butchering your name, Arielen. But would you use the emotional metrics with beneficiaries of some of your beneficiaries some social impact programs to determine the bias of the organizations and the NGOs implementing them?
Um, the determination of someone's unconscious bias is always a difficult, challenging situation. Um, One of the things that happens is if you have that barometer within you, and you are the leadership, um, you can not only sense your own emotion, but you can sense the emotions of others. If you see that what you're doing is heightening to almost painful level the team, the community, you will understand better, having created that barometer, what is happening. Frequently, that unconscious bias and the emotional attachment to it remains in the realm of fuzzy, vague, uh, surely this will pass category, which it will not. Uh, so building that barometer gives you a better idea of where things are headed.
Thank you, Deborah. Our next question comes from JJ No from Columbia University, and JJ provides a bit of background before his question. And JJ writes, I faced a challenge before I went to work in the field over the summer. I've bought multiple books on Israel and Palestine, the conflict itself, the people there, etc. However, I was a bit resistant towards reading them before I went to Jerusalem in order to avoid having certain perceptions and biases. Would you say it's more beneficial to have just enough knowledge to not be shocked once you arrive, and then reading later to compare your observations, or would you rather learn about the setting and the people before?
My view on this one is that there is a lot to be read that you should read. However, there needs to be an awareness that there are biases built into most of what you're going to read. In a divisive arena such as the Middle East and Israeli-Palestinian relations, uh, there is there are people who are able to bridge both And that's what you also need to read. And I will say that I have written on this myself, if the person is interested in seeing that. But understanding the basic history involved in both sides is key. And to go there without the understanding of that culture map, which I showed earlier, maybe I can go back to it, right? The geography and history, the demographics and diversity, the mindset and beliefs, and how they all interconnect is key. That is your basic communication, cultural competence tool to look at that and organize your information in those different categories so that your brain can hold it all. A lot of folks going over to Jerusalem are going to be surprised. As I said at the outset, the goal of this isn't to give you 100% surety of what you're going to see and find and hear. That's never going to happen, but gives you the process to be able to navigate these difficult situations. So read as much as you can, but be aware. There's very little neutral in this.
Great, thank you, Deborah. Our next question comes from Anais Kapu, who is my colleague at Search for Common Ground and our designing learning specialist. And
Yes.
Anais asks, what kind of measurements or assessment tools do you or the organizations you work with use to assess the impact of your interventions on organizational culture?
Yes, I think that's a very, pointed question because all too often we do feel good stuff and hope for the best. What I do in the team workshops, facilitated workshops, is take periodic measurements in writing of where people are, so that I can assess the change just within the workshop itself. And then I suggest that you repeat the workshop in 6 months and again in another 6 months so that you can map the changes in the repetition of the workshops so that you see that it is heightened. And those evaluation sheets are kept and put into a database so that you can see very clearly from beginning to end the change in the thinking of your participants. One of the things that is shown up in that is, for example, I ask in the beginning of a workshop, raise your hands as you look around the room and you see how diverse the room is. And now I want you to grade it on diversity from 1 to 4, 1 being very, very diverse, and 4 not being diverse at all, really. And then I will ask you how many of you graded it as a 1, as a 2, and a 3, and a 4, and then make notes. And then at the end, I will ask the same question, and almost invariably, those numbers have changed to reflect a greater awareness within the whole room. So I measure.
Great, thank you very much, Deborah. Our next question comes from Belinda Calaguas, and Belinda writes, how does the process of understanding one's own unconscious bias happen through storytelling? In an organizational environment where there are suspicions of racism and sexism, staff to staff and management to staff, where does one start?
All right. There have been a number of ideas put forth on this. Some people just say, well, let's listen to each other's stories so that we can understand the pain that they have undergone, and better see our role in it. I think that's a more advanced level of the storytelling process. So I begin with storytelling that is very easy and unemotional for the most part. The whole process is put together very simply. Everybody in the team starts to create a story using the 4 levels, okay, for where are you, who are you with, for example. If you're at a number 1, that's ideal. If you're at a number 2, it's okay. At a number 3, not so wonderful, kind of uncomfortable. Number 4, no, it's a nightmare. And for each one of them, I asked them to put a cultural expression, like, say, music. And you'd be amazed at the different stories that start to come out, and to be able to share them together in a low impact situation before you go into the storytelling that is more substantial and personal. I use that system of the low impact stories to also teach how then to change a situation from a nightmare to okay, because the process has to be taught first before the details are then made more emotional, and that's how it's done. You give them
Great.
the
Thank you, Deborah. Our next question comes from another Deborah, Deborah Baldwin. And Deborah Baldwin writes, how essential is understanding intercultural conflict style for leaders in the problem-solving phase?
yes, the looking at cultural competence includes understanding styles. Mindsets and beliefs also include styles. Those styles are embedded into the culture along with its geography, history, demographics. Some cultures will be extremely pointed and direct, others, and this is one of the things that happened here in the South, others, like the South, you do not criticize people publicly. It's key to your success in one hand. On the other hand, you do not want to totally give up your own style. Some of it is trial and error of how much of which you can do, but the awareness is key. The awareness is key so that you make the conscious choices and you just don't go barreling in.
Great. Thank you very much, Deborah. I think we have time for one last question, and this again comes from Nathan Bala, who asks, what were your biggest challenges in the process of both designing the matrix as well as the implementation of this model?
Okay. And when I created the Women's Council on Diversity in Chattanooga, back in 2001, it followed 9/11. And it was a time of heightened fear and emotion, and it was really necessary. And I pulled together people who had not necessarily been public figures. Maybe they were had particular jobs within their churches, in their communities. They did a lot of work, but they may not have been publicly known. And I did that on purpose because I wanted to grow a whole new cadre of leaders. And in doing that, I created worksheets for the matrix model management And we worked on this process for 4 years before finalizing it completely, testing it, refining it. And one of the biggest issues that came up was creating the public persona that was comfortable for these new leaders. And we ran into some difficulties with people who are definitely against the idea of diversity, of cross-cultural communication at all. That was a huge challenge. And I believe that we have been able to overcome it and be mainstream through this process. And that was my goal.
Great. Well, Deborah, I think that is the perfect moment to wrap today's conversation up. I want to thank you for being a wonderful host and for giving us such a detailed presentation and being so sort of open during the question and answer session. To those of you on the line, I know a couple of you have asked. Yes, this webinar is recorded and it's going to be posted on the DME for Peace Media Gallery. So if you go to www.dmeforpeace.org, you'll be able to find the recording there. And yeah, just as we wrap up today, I want to thank everybody for joining and thank you for your continued support of the Thursday Talks. We'll be back in a couple of weeks' time, and we're looking forward to seeing you online again soon for another webinar. Thank you, Deborah, and thank you to everyone online. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.